My name is Sharlene Sachs. My date of birth is December the 22nd, 1933.
Where were you born?
Fayetteville, close to Wheeler, Arkansas.
Okay. And this interview is for the Farmington Oral History Project, and we just want to be sure that we have your permission to reuse the interview. Do we have your permission?
You have my permission to use this interview.
Thank you. Can you tell me, who were your parents?
My parents were B.B. Holland and Pearl Jones Holland.
Okay. Tell me about your family, your siblings, your brothers and sisters.
I have two older sisters. They are both deceased. And my oldest sister was a nurse that worked for Dr. Buckley for a number of years. And my other sister was a housewife. And she lived in Oklahoma, and she's deceased. And then I have two brothers and a younger sister. My oldest brother is deceased. His name was L.B. And I have a brother, Vernon Holland, and Barbara Wynn, still surviving.
Okay, thank you. Tell me about your family's business. What kind of work did your parents do?
My parents were farmers. They what was called truck farms. They had berry patches, and they also raised beans, and the things you picked had pickers come, and they were weighed by a cotton scale, and then they were taken to, you were paid so much per pound for your beans, and the strawberries so much a quart. But you didn't get paid till they took it to market in Springdale on their truck and tried to get the best price, and then they'd come back and you would go back to them and you would turn in your strawberry tickets that you got to get paid.
Okay. What was your part in the family business?
I worked in the fields. I helped plow with a one-horse plow. My brother and I laid off a bean field one year and planted the beans because my dad was sick with having chills. So my brother put the bean field in, and when it came time to pick it, well, we worked in the fields to pick beans.
What was it like picking at that age, and how old were you, and what was it like?
Hot. You wore a straw hat, and you got down there and you worked, filled up a basket of beans, and then you would take them and pour them in a tow sack, and then they were weighed, and you got so much a pound for it.
Okay. What other jobs did you do when you were a kid and a teenager?
That's mostly all, was working on the farm.
Okay. What was it like around your house? Tell me where you lived and what it was like at your house.
I've always lived in close to White Rock community because that's where I went to school. We lived off of 16 down Hamstring Road till I was up in about the 7th grade, and then we moved up to the highway. My dad built a house, and I went to school and finished grade school at White Rock, and then went to Farmington from there.
What are your earliest memories of Farmington?
I remember that we had to walk the first few days because they were re-graveling 16 Highway, which is now called Weddington. But we had to walk from there all the way to Farmington for a few days until they got that done, and then I rode the bus. It was kind of scary going from a one-room schoolhouse to one room and changing rooms and stuff like that.
Who do you remember from the school? What was it like attending school in Farmington?
Farmington was great. We didn't have a gym when I first started. It was outside court. We didn't have indoor bathrooms when I started. They were out quite a ways from the building. And it wasn't until the next year that we had a gym built and could play indoor. And then they also remodeled the inside and put in bathrooms.
Do you know about what year that might have been?
Should have been about 49, the summer of maybe 48, that they worked on that to upgrade the school.
Okay. Who are some of the teachers you remember there?
Mrs. Weaver, she taught algebra and math. And Mrs. Ferguson taught civics and history. Then Mrs. Shook was a home ec teacher. And there was Mrs. Lombara that was a homeroom teacher and I think English teacher, health teacher. And Mrs. Growl was one of our favorite teachers we had. And
tell me why she was your favorite.
She was younger and jolly, always had a smile, just really a special person.
Okay. What about some of your classmates and friends? Who are some of those you remember?
Our class was very small. There was 15 that's supposed to have graduated, but there was only 12 of us that attended school at that time. The others had enough credits to go on to university. And Lula Mae Newport was one I rode the bus with a lot, because rode the same bus. She lived over close to Wheeler, Arkansas. And there was James Knight. And of course my husband was in the group, and Harold Jones, and Geraldine Chesser. There was Betty Lou Clevenger, who's gone. Not very many of us is left out of the group anymore.
What are some of the local stores and businesses in Farmington that you remember?
The first ones, it was later before, the main one that started years ago was Phillips Grocery. That was the main one that started, that was close to the Baptist church down there. And then later on there was Witter store that was still in business at that time, and then Rico White's store was open at that time.
What can you remember about some of the owners, store owners or shopkeepers?
The Phillips, the people didn't shop too much there when other stores was available, and he was kind of cranky. But the Witter's place was pretty good. They was friendly people.
Who are some of the other local people or merchants maybe that you remember when you were a kid?
The post office.
Tell me about that.
The post office was run by Clara and Russell Broyles at that time, and it was across the street from Witter's grocery store. Before that, Witter's was getting the mail in little boxes there, and Farmington outgrew the little boxes that they had slots to put the mail in, and so they built the post office. And it was in business when I started to high school, the post office was. But Claire and Russell Broyles run it.
What can you tell me about them?
They were really neat people. They were friendly, always willing to post stuff from the school if there was something going on. And they were just really neat.
Do you remember, what can you remember about the history of the post offices from that very first one until now? There's been a lot of changes. Do you remember all the different post offices?
Yeah, a lot of them. It went from there to, I think, across the street for a period of time. They built one, and then they built the bigger one across well, next to the animal hospital. And then this final one they built now that's in the, I call it the shopping center.
What do you remember about Starks? Do you remember anything about the
Starks?
Tell me what you remember.
I remember about Starks is that they had fields that they grafted. I don't know what type of trees they were grafting together to produce something else. And I remember the fields of those when I was growing up.
Did you or your family ever grow for Starks?
No, my two older sisters hoed around the little plants that was growing at one time.
What do you remember them telling you about that?
They just didn't like to work in the field, but they did because they got paid for it, you know.
Tell me about some more of the people in Farmington that you remember throughout the years, maybe from way back in the day.
Like I said, the Broyleses, I remember those. They were Buddy Elkins, after took over on the post office after Broyleses finished their time. And of course, he worked in one of the newer places. And he was postmaster for several years. I think before that, he probably drove, delivered mail on a route. But, and that was way before the present post office.
Did your family attend church in Farmington? And if you did, where did you go?
No, I attended church at Providence. That was out on off of 16 for a period of time, and then they built a bigger place, and it's no longer a church building. It's a church. It's a building, but they've got it rented out, I think. They're not holding church.
When you were a young kid growing up, what did you and your friends and siblings do for fun?
We'd meet at one another's place. We had croquet games. We'd have ball games, work up we'd call it, you know, where if you made an out, you went to the field and you'd had to change places with one another till you worked up to be at bat. That's what we call work up. We did that. And that's basically, we didn't have basketball goals.
What did the adults do for fun back in those days?
They just got together to visit, and that's all I know. They attended church and sang. I can remember one time they didn't have a church and for the Pentecost, and my dad loved their singing. And so he got boards and blocks, and they built places for people to sit and had preacher to come out, and they had singing and preaching service. and all at the house until they got their own church.
Interesting. When you were a kid growing up, did y'all have electricity? Do you remember
No.
getting electricity? Tell me about that.
No, when growing up there was no electricity out to where we lived. And you did the wash on a rub board. And the white clothes was put in a big old kettle, iron kettle with fire in under it, and you boiled the white sheets and pillowcases and stuff and dishcloths. And you always hung them on the line. There was no dryers. So you did it on rub board.
How hard? Tell me how hard that was to do.
It was pretty hard because you had to draw the water out of the well by a bucket, rope. You know, we let the bucket down in the well and bring the water up and carry it, pour it in another bucket and carry it out to the kettle, fill the kettle, and then you'd have to put water in the rinse tub.
Do you remember getting electricity? And if you do, what was that like?
It was a long time coming. I'm trying to think if I was in about the 6th, 7th grade before we got electricity. And it was better to have lights and also be able to have the radio on instead of off of a car battery that you had to share with the car because that's all you had was a radio that ran off of a car battery.
When you first got electricity, what appliances did you have, if any?
Lights is all. Yeah, lights.
Do you remember getting a washing machine for the first time? If you do, tell me about it.
Before we got electricity, my dad had bought a washer, wringer washer, and down at Savoy they had electricity, and my mom and them had a friend, the Abners, and so they took the washer down there, and we would go down to her house, and they all did laundry one day and hang them on the line. And then finally we got electricity down to our place. It didn't come down that far. It only came to 16 highway, and we was about a mile and a half, 2 miles off. And made it brightness. Didn't have to sit by a kerosene lamp for our mom to read us our story. I remember we'd have to get the dishes done and everything, and then she would get the kerosene lamp and put it on the library table and get her chair over there, and we'd gather around her. And Hilda, my oldest sister, was in high school, and she'd check out a book, The Yearling. Every night she would read a chapter or two to us as we gathered around her with the kerosene light. And so that's what I remember a lot of.
When you were a kid, let's talk about when you would come into town. How you said sometimes you walked to school. How did y'all as a family come into Farmington?
We rode in the back of a pickup, but we didn't come to town very often. My dad would come to town and buy the groceries. My mom would make out the grocery list, and he would buy the groceries. Or he would, if we needed shoes, they'd measure our feet, and my dad would buy the shoes and bring them in.
When did you move to this house in Farmington? And how long have you lived here?
I've lived here in this house. My youngest one was a baby at the time we lived in this house. We bought it from, his grandparents built it. And we bought it, and 2.5 acres at that time. And so she's in her 50s now, so it's been 50 years that I've lived here.
Tell me about the change you've seen in Farmington, what it was like when you first came compared to now.
You knew your neighbors, you knew the people, you knew everyone. And church was a big thing too. And we went to church with them down, and it was a good time. But now everybody, you don't know your neighbors. They're not friendly. They don't want to be bothered with you.
What was the road in through town like when you first came to Farmington?
I've been trying to think. I don't think it was paved at that time. I'm not sure, but I know it was mostly scattered houses and farms, and now it's fields of businesses and houses that used to have cattle on them.
Did you ever go to the old Farmington festivals they had back in the 70s and early 80s? Do you remember any of those?
No.
You didn't? Did you ever go to any of the annual Farmington Firemen's breakfasts that they would have?
I didn't go to them.
Yeah. What are some of the things you might have done in Farmington besides, you said church, but is there other events you went to in town that you remember?
I worked. When I got out of high school, and even after I was married, I worked at City Hospital as a nursing assistant. So I had very little time off.
How long did you work there? Tell us about that.
I worked up until I quit there when I think my second child was maybe, I'm trying to think if she was about 2 or so. And then I went to Standard Register and worked. And
what are some other things you can remember about Farmington, maybe that I haven't thought to ask about?
Well, one time they had singing, had a singer to come, and they roasted a pig and all, and had that and all, and we went to that. My husband helped with roasting of the pig and all.
Where did they do it, and about what year was it?
I don't know what year that was done, but it was, and I don't remember the singer now, but he's gone. He's no longer living. But it was a big affair, you know.
Were you ever involved in any of the efforts to build the senior center, or to, because they started many years ago on that project? Did you help them at all with that?
No, I didn't.
What are some things you got involved in that maybe you could tell us more about?
Like I said, I worked so much. I worked. Yeah, when you work as a nurse aide, you spend, you don't get many days off. Sometimes you worked up to 2 weeks before you had time off. And I worked in the nursery and saw Bill Beckett's baby born and all.
If
Yeah.
somebody that you met asked you about Farmington and they didn't know anything about Farmington, they said, "Tell me something about your town of Farmington," what would you tell them?
I'd tell them it's a good town. I'd recommend it. There's a lot of things they could do, be a part of. There's churches, they could pick whatever church, you know, there's, you know, you've got a good place to go.
If I ask you to finish this sentence, what would you say? My favorite thing about Farmington is. How would you say that sentence?
Well, my favorite thing about Farmington, I think, is the people that's there. They've been a part of my life for years, you know, and their kids grow up, and you kind of you see their picture in the paper and all, and you're proud of them. Just can't pop buttons like your parents, of course, but you're proud of their accomplishments too, because they're a part of our community, and their advancement means help for us, and you know, it's just like family.
Anything else you can want to say?
No, I like Farmington. I do all my business, and I said you take care of your community. You shop in your own town and buy in your own town before you go venturing out. And that's what I tell my kids. Think of Farmington first. And if you can't find it, then you have to go someplace else to find what you need. But Farmington has really grown. We got grocery store now. We got several places. And it's handy for me